Another Monday is here, and I was noticing when I was looking at the last video I uploaded, there was something wrong with my voice, like it was being played at a slower clip or a lower octave or something, and there were breaks in the audio. I hope this one doesn't do that. But this one's about car cancer and how we saved the Ford and the GMC from certain death. And there's some other stories in here too that I thought that we all might benefit from looking at. And these two pickups were dying of rust. There was a 97 F-150 with 190,000 miles. Well, this GMC only had 39,000 miles on it, and it was the brakes were out on the GMC, and the Ford was leaking coolant. And so, this Ford had a lot of miles behind it, and the guy hadn't really treated it properly either. These vehicles were eventually going to die, like any vehicle will eventually, but they weren't going to die today because we were going to bring them back from the brink because they were brought to the hospital, so to speak. Now, entropy means that, well, you can look at the definition here. You know, this car, let me get my little thing. This car right here will eventually one day wind up looking like this. Actually, this is the same car, believe it or not. Now, I reversed these photos because the car looked like this when it was new. And whenever it had been parked in a barn for a long time after they quit driving it, it deteriorated to the point that it looked like this. And so here we were with entropy, and anything you park like that is going to come apart over time. Buildings fall in, and all kinds of stuff goes wrong whenever something is left unattended, because order naturally moves to disorder. That's just the way it is. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And what it basically means is everything that's heated will one day cool down. Everything that's moving will one day stop moving, and everything that's assembled is one day going to fall apart. It's going to return to the elements it came from. That's just the way entropy is. And this usually happens worse when one is parked, but it also happens when it's being driven if it's not treated right. All right. Now, this one here was sitting for about a year because the guy's daughter owned the vehicle, and she was in the Navy, and she was overseas. And for some reason, everybody had a vehicle to drive. This guy had several daughters. And so her Honda Element just sat there and wasn't driven for about a year. And it didn't have very many miles on it. It was still under basic warranty at the time. Obviously, this was several years ago. And so it was sitting parked all those months. And when he started driving it, he was alarmed because it had a really nasty sound coming from the brakes, particularly the rear brakes. And you can see where this is going. But the dealer wanted to charge him $1,000 to replace the brakes and rotors on all four wheels, even though the vehicle was still under basic warranty. I'm trying to remember. It may have been out of warranty on time, but not miles or something, but it was just nearly a new vehicle by Honda standards, And these people just had the idea of the dealership, and this was, there was another guy that took his Honda to the same dealership, and he was just getting an oil change. And they were wanting to charge him, seems to me like he went ahead and gave him the go-ahead. And they charged him $400 to rebuild just his front brakes, which I don't even know if he needed it or not. But anyway, that was neither here nor there, But I do know about the one that I was talking about. We brought the 08 Element in there because this guy actually was somebody I knew pretty well. And his daughter was in my program at the time. So she drove it over there, and the front brakes had almost no wear at all. There was nothing wrong with them. And the rear rotors had accumulated a bunch of rust on the braking surface, because that's where the rust starts, where the brakes are always making contact. But everything was fine as far as the thickness of the rotors. The pads weren't even worn down enough to replace. I mean, you could have replaced the pads, but whatever. And so we mounted the rotors on the lathe and used the refinishing disc, on the drill to clean that rust off the rotors. And then I took the pads, and we used a file to rasp the rust off the pads. Put it back together, drove it perfectly. Well, while that vehicle was in the shop, there was another vehicle in the shop that was Chrysler Sebring that belonged to one of the maintenance men. Now, this particular maintenance man, they would get more than one. This particular maintenance man was kind of a shyster, and he was always trying to put the screws to somebody. And he had his vehicle in there for brakes. And so we got brake pads and machined his rotors and put new pads on there and all that kind of thing. But he happened to walk by the shop and he saw us filing the pads for this Honda. And he thought that was his pads we were filing. And after I handed him the invoice for his brake work on his Sebring, he refused to pay for it because he said, I don't think you put brakes on my vehicle. I think you just filed them off. And boy, that just irritated me to no end. And I would not give him another work order after that. Wouldn't work on his vehicle anymore on the, in the department. In other words, usually they make a work order and then they pay the office and all that. Well, he just refused to pay that bill because, and I think he just felt like he had something going there. But everybody that was in the shop knew that we had done his brakes, that there was nothing you could do or nothing you could show him to convince him that, that we had. And he was looking for an opportunity not to pay anyway, I think. You just can't do business with people like that. Well, at the Mazda dealership, a similar situation arose. This woman came in on an almost brand new GLC. Now, this is back when I worked there in the 80s. And it had a strange brake pulsation. It didn't feel like a normal, thick and thin rotor thing. But she had parked that thing somewhere, and the rotor right under the pads had trapped some water. And it sat there. I don't know if it was the airport or what. It sat there long enough that those rotors rusted in that one patch, that one place. And when she was stopping, every time that rust patch would go under those pads, it would, make a little pulse. And so this vehicle was so new and everything was in such good shape. I said, we don't really need to replace a bunch of parts on this. So I had to put a socket on my drill, put the transmission in neutral, and I, took the caliper off and everything. And I spun that rotor using the, CV axle nut up to about 5,000 RPM, and I held some 80 grit sandpaper up against that rotor on both sides with it, and I smoothed all that rust off, and it stopped like a perfectly new car. What was funny was the service manager, who was the guy that I had gone to school with, walked over there and says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm, fixing this lady's car. She doesn't need any new parts." He goes, "You ain't making this no money." I said, "Well, what I want to do is fix the car surgically without throwing a bunch of parts at it." And I understand the guy at the parts room likes to sell rotors and all this, but I said, let's just go ahead and fix this lady's car. And her bill was only like $20 or something like that. And she was really excited about that because she was expecting to pay a whole lot more. And anytime somebody goes to the dealer and their vehicle is fixed satisfactorily and safely and all that, and the bill is a lot less than they expected, they're going to come back for more work, and they're going to talk good about you if anybody asks how was your experience at that dealer. Well, this shiny black Sonoma only had 38,000 miles on it, but the brakes were making a grinding noise. And the owner figured it might go away. It didn't go away. As a matter of fact, it got worse. And then all at once, she lost just about all of her brakes. And she had to limp from wherever she was to the front door of the shop. It was really dangerous. And she had blown the caliper. And I'm telling you, the pads were completely gone on both sides of that rotor. And that caliper had come completely out. This was a nasty mess. And that's all the brake fluid that had, splattered all over. Went all over the tire whenever she had hit the brakes with that blown caliper. And the rotors, were really, really bad, rusty and all that. This truck had lots of rust on it for some reason. I guess it came from up north, I don't know. But see how the pads were completely gone, and you basically had the caliper scrubbing against that thing? This was ridiculous. The undercarriage had seen road salt, apparently. That's what I'm saying. You never really know why, but we worked on some vehicles that came from places up in like New York, and I know you guys that work up in that part of the world have got it a lot harder than we do down there in the South because everything's a daggum rusty up there. Down in Galveston, Texas, where the salt air is, though, some of the filling stations used to actually do, when they would do oil changes, they would also spray oil all underneath the vehicle and coat the frame and the underneath part of the fenders and all with oil to kind of protect them from that salt air. And then there's the undercoating. You know, we used to do that when I was at the Volkswagen dealer with undercoat vehicles and all that. But, well, we got ahead. You might notice this caliper that comes with a new cage. This is a caliper for one of those vehicles, but when you buy it, you get this whole thing, not just the part that we had pulled off to look at. And so the rest of the metal brake lines didn't look bad. It's really something how some of the brake lines will get really rusty and some won't on the same vehicle. That's very strange. Of course, a lot of these brake lines are, whenever they start to get rusty and compromised, it's real, one of them may bust on you all of a sudden. And I've seen that more than a few times. And it's just without warning, the brake line, you know, and you lose half your brake, or, you know, the split brake system is still enable you to stop typically. Well, the steel line leading to the HCU from the brake hose, you know, right there at the brake hose when Frank was replacing it, it basically twisted off while he was replacing the flexible hose. And I'm talking about right here, this twisted off when he held that and tried to take this loose. This was seized to the nut and it came off of there. Well, it was peachy keen. So the dealer didn't have one. You know, the line had a different kind of fitting on the other end. So I said, well, maybe the parts store will have something with the right fittings on both ends. So I sent it over there, and he figured he was going to fix it. He cut the line and put it together with a copper tubing union, which is dreadfully wrong. You're basically supposed to do a couple of double flares and use one of these double flare unions to do that. That's the way you're supposed to do brakes, because brakes lines have got to hold about 2,000 psi, particularly in a panic stop. And this isn't terribly accurate because there's a flexible hose in here. On this, you know, this is supposed to be the caliper, and that's the master cylinder, and blah blah. You know, this is the hydraulic control unit, and so on and so forth. But this is 2,000 psi, and if those lines get rusty and they actually get to where they can't hold that pressure, then, you know, one of the reasons they make brake lines so small is because if you don't have a lot of square inches, they're better able to contain 2,000 pounds per square inch. Of course, they also have that coiled brake line going from, you know, up to the master cylinder. That does a couple of things. It lets the brake line flex a little bit as the car moves on its frame, but it also helps cool the brake fluid so it doesn't boil because of the engine heat. Well, this one here sprung a coolant leak right after a January cold snap, and we figured the repair would be quick and easy. The guy did, so he took it to a shop in the town where he lives, and they gave him a $1,000 estimate. They said, we got to replace all the freeze plugs. It was just raining coolant out from under this thing everywhere, which made them believe that, but they didn't try to figure out where the coolant was coming from. They just figured, well, with it leaking everywhere, it's leaking right after a cold snap, it had to have pushed a whole bunch of freeze plugs out or whatever. You know, they call it expansion plugs. They're not really there to keep it from being damaged by freezing. Well, we fixed one leaking expansion plug and pressure tested the coolant system. We found the intake gasket leaking like a sieve on both sides. And these intake gaskets, and Chevy uses them too, and Dodge uses them. These things will fail over time and just all of a sudden start to leak in a big way. It's what the only kind of vehicle I've seen this on. Well, with the coolant running back, driven from many places, you know, you can understand why they call that. We put the intake gasket on there, upper and lower. That's the upper and that's the lower. Fired up the engine, and even after the air was burnt out, it slowly would overheat in the service bay, but only when you had the filler cap on it. Now, I figured that out for a minute. So, anyway, we went ahead, you know, not a bad idea to go ahead and put a thermostat in it. And we put a pressure gauge on it, make sure there wasn't any rapid pressure rise in the coolant system, which tells you that you got a head gasket issue. One of the things you can do is you can take one of your rubber gloves or a balloon or something, and you can put it over the radiator neck and start the engine cold. And if that thing immediately starts to inflate, you know you've got some combustion gases getting into the cooling system. But it never would go above 220 if we took the cap off. But if we put the cap on, it would start to get hot. You think, what the heck is this about? Oh, we actually had done a borescope inspection on the radiator, found all this clogged up, rusty junk all down in there. And so we went and put a new radiator in it and burnt the cooling system. And this thing ran cool at 220 degrees or 210, even at high RPM with the cap installed. So we made a difference when we put the radiator on there. You could put the cap on it. It would sit there and idle all day long at 210 degrees. But that's when it gets weird. We go to the test drive. We drove it on the road before we didn't even get to the road. We were in the parking lot, backing out of the service bay before you could even get to the driveway and get out of the road. This thing would spike up to like 240 degrees. Looking at it with a scan tool and looking at the gauge, this was bad. And this was spooky and didn't make any sense, especially since we put a clean radiator in and it wouldn't overheat when it was idling, which was very odd. And so the only component that could produce so many large rust flakes, like we found in the radiator, was the stamped steel impeller. But we pulled the water pump off and the impeller had come off the water pump. Now, how this thing managed to run cool sitting in the service bay boggles my mind. You can understand, it seemed like it would have overheated no matter what, and why it didn't start overheating until after you pulled off. This was what the new water pump would look like. But the owner had only drove a truck to work and back, and it's less than 2 miles each way. And so this had been like this for a while, but he had never driven it far enough so that it had begun to overheat on him because he only drove it a couple of miles each way every day. Now look at this one here. This is another failure on a Dodge Caravan.
And that just spins around like it wants to. And that, I expect, would probably make us overheat. Because this is supposed to move with that, but as it turns out, it ain't doing it.
And I said, this is not good. So we went ahead and pulled the water pump off and found out that this little aluminum bushing had come loose from the shaft. And see, this one here is not going to rust like the other one did, but it was still able to come loose from the shaft. And so just keep that in mind. Now, this is a spat that I got into with the parts guys about the radiator caps. Ever since my filling station days, I learned that the coolants, this little valve should not dangle when you hold the cap. This is what a bad one looks like. And when we see a radiator cap like that, I would always replace it. And that had been that way for years and decades. And then all of a sudden I started getting stant caps that were brand new, still on the card with the dangling valve. And so I would call the parts guy and I say, look, this thing's got a dangling valve. I don't want to put it on there because that's why I'm replacing the other one. And so he would find another one on the shelf that had the same part number all the way down the line, and it wouldn't have a dangling valve. But he called Stant, the radiator cap people, about it, and they acted like it was supposed to be this way. Never mind that not all of them are. And some of their new stock has got a dangling valve, and some of it doesn't, even though the part numbers are the same. And they sold him some dog and pony show about the supposedly it's supposed to keep pressure from rising too fast in the coolant system and damaging the hoses. Does that sound right to you? If that was the case, this would be a good cap and that would be a bad one. This just never made any sense to me, and sometimes it makes you wonder where they're even coming from. Well, that finishes up the video today. It wasn't very long, but I hope it turns out okay and it doesn't have a slow, choppy voice like I had on last week's video. And I thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next week.